General Menon, you can get started.
Right. So good evening, everybody. And on behalf of Takshashila Institution, it's my proud privilege to firstly welcome Ambassador Shivshankar Menon. And before I introduce him, may I introduce all of you to Takshashila. And Takshashila has been around for 10 years. And what we're actually doing today, it's been doing for a very long time. We've been online on the internet, delivering our courses. Zoom is very familiar to us. So Takshashila is a networked think tank and a school of public policy in Bangalore. And as an independent, non-partisan policy research think tank, we are engaged with India's relationship with the world, transforming how India is governed, and exploring the intersection of technology, economics, and politics. For those of you who are interested, please take a look at our website and look at the education programs we offer. We have short ones and year-long ones, all of which give you a wide choice. We have a graduate program in public policy, defense and foreign affairs, technology, and biotech policy. We also have a postgraduate course, which is a year-long course in public policy. So stay connected, stay with us. And we're actually running a marathon, and we don't believe that everything can be done tomorrow. But we believe that the effort is worth it, however it might be. And we don't judge ourselves by how much impact we created. We judge ourselves by the effort that we put in. So Ambassador Menon, this requires no introduction. I was wondering, how do you introduce a person who requires no introduction? For those of us who know him, and all of you know that he was former Foreign Secretary of India, a very distinguished diplomat, a long-time national security advisor, author of the book Choices, and I've had the privilege of working with him. And I would think he's probably one of the minds in India, which has one very, I think, remarkable quality that he can go to the heart of the situation and see it from the center of its gravity. And I think that's a thing which very few people have. And today he's going to talk to us on India and the post-COVID world. And in conversation with him would be the China dude from Takshashila, Manoj Kevalramani, another remarkable man who's now widely known both in India and abroad. So without wasting much time, may I hand over the floor to Manoj? The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, General Menon. Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ambassador Menon, for joining us. It's a pleasure and a privilege to have you here with us. And there's lots of stuff that we need to talk about. But before we sort of get into the conversation, I wanted to just clear out some simple house rules that what we're going to try and do is that we're going to try and speak for about 30 odd minutes. We have about 90 minutes. So we're going to try and speak for about 30 odd minutes. And I'll try and cap my enthusiasm till that, so that I don't sort of eat up everybody's time. And I'll try and set the context. We'll try and set the context within those 30 minutes. And then we'll try and have at least around an hour of questions from the audience, given that there's such a massive audience is joining us at this point of time. So it would be good to have people ask the questions that they would like to ask. And I can be the conduit for that. For all of you who is attending, thank you so much for joining us on this Wednesday evening. The fact that there is such a large audience tells me that there is a lot of interest in what India is doing in the world and India's engagement with the world, and there's a desire for clear-eyed, informed, nuanced expertise that can put all this together, and that's where Ambassador Menon you come in for us, who can do that for us, because there are very few in the world who can actually do that for us. So with that, folks, if there are questions that you would need to ask, there's a Q&A box in Zoom. Please feel free to post your questions even while the conversation is going on. That will help us curate them and prioritize them so that we can try and get in as many as possible. So thank you so much for joining us, and hope everybody has fun with this conversation. Ambassador Menon, I want to begin. So since the subject that we're looking at is India in the post-COVID world, so there are two sort of there's a protagonist here and there's a circumstance here. The protagonist is India, and the circumstance, the scenario that it finds itself is in the post-COVID world. So we'll try and touch on both of these aspects of the story. But to begin with, Ambassador Menon, what animates India's foreign policy? I mean, you've been part of the evolution of Indian foreign policy. You've shaped that evolution over the decades. What are the interests how does one come to understand our interests? Is it a sense of manifest destiny of becoming a great power? Is it, becoming a regional dominant player? Is it becoming that member of the United Nations Security Council? Or are these aspects of a broader goal? How would one characterize what animates India's foreign policy?
Thank you, Manoj, and thank you, Prakash, for that very flattering introduction. It's not easy to live up to. But, and thank you also for this opportunity, for asking me. But to go straight into what you asked, Manoj, about what is India's larger interest? Well, what are we seeking? And why do we interact with the world? For me, and I think some of you have heard me say this before, given our condition at independence and even today, I think our primary task, national, and every government, I think, irrespective of which party, has believed that our task is to transform India into a modern, secure, prosperous country where every Indian can achieve their potential. We might differ on the details of what means, what we think is modernity, what kind of India, but ultimately we want to transform India. And that, for me, is the basis that drives Indian foreign policy and has driven it so far. It's not some manifest destiny. It's not Lebensraum. It's not revenge for partition. It's certainly not a seat on the UN Security Council, which I think I've made it quite clear. If that were to contribute to the welfare of Indians, I would say go for it. Even great power status is only useful if it helps us to transform India, to make India secure, prosperous, make it possible for every Indian to try and achieve his or her potential. That, for me, is the key. And that has certain other downstream sort of corollaries. One is that without economic strength, there is no way that we can do the rest of what we're talking of a much bigger political role, and this hits us in the face every day. Today, we are much more connected to the world than we ever have been before. If you think of GDP, and when we started radical reform in 1991, only about 15.3% of GDP was external merchandise trade. By 2014, it was all the way up to 49.6%. It's dropped since then for obvious reasons, but you are connected to the world. Over 80% of your imports are maintenance imports. We import energy, we import fertilizer, we import machine tools, we import technology, we import capital. We import things that are essential if we want to transform India. We cannot do this on our own. We don't have either the resource endowment or the money or the capacity, quite frankly, when you look at it in the larger. We need to work with the world. So what we need to do, therefore, is to the extent that we have the ability, to try and shape the environment. If not, at least to work with those elements in the environment around us, in the situation around us, which can help us to transform India. And that includes a whole host of things. It changes from time to time, but we work with all the partners whom we can find. And for me, therefore, engaging with the world is critical. But the purpose of Indian foreign policy is to enable the transformation of India and is to, where possible, create or enable or shape the environment so that that transformation is hastened. And hopefully we will continue to do as we have so far. We haven't done badly, certainly in the last 40 years. If you look at it by most metrics of power, India has done better than almost every other country on earth except China, which has done even better. I mean, in the decade after 2001, we pulled something like 140 million people out of poverty. That's unprecedented in history. We've done reasonably, but we still have a very long way to go. And we can see reminders of that every day. We've seen the migrant workers and their condition when they've had to walk home. This is not the India of our dreams. We still have a long way to go. And so for me, our primary interest in transforming India and that task for foreign policy, that will remain for some time to come. I don't think that will change.
All right. So,
and I can list, there are other things that go with that. I mean, transforming India is a big idea, but you need a peaceful periphery. You don't want to get dragged into other people's wars, etc., etc. You know, social peace at home, coherence, good sense. I mean, we can go on. But that's a book in itself.
Yeah. Okay. So Ambassador Menon, you spoke about transforming India, and that's been sort of that primary goal that we've had ever since independence. And ever since, and our engagement with the world has largely sort of, the objective of that engagement is for this purpose. And we've encountered different sort of, for the lack of a better term, world orders, or at least different sort of structures that we've encountered externally. Soon after we became independent, there was a lot of chaos of the post-colonial world, sort of the early chaos, and then that transformed into this Cold War. The Soviet Union collapsed, the Cold War ended, and you had the unipolar moment. That's now well past us. And most analysts who've been writing about this sort of new world order that's been emerging, and we at Takshashila have also got this big project on called the New World Order Project, where we've tried to sort of conceptualize of different scenarios, and across different axes, without trying to fall in the avoiding to fall in the trap of predicting one, because it's really, really difficult to do that. But I want to sort of put you in that hot seat. Firstly, can you tell me what are the trends that have been shaping this new order? Because nobody's been able to even clearly come up with a name for this new order at this point of time. What are the larger trends that are shaping this order pre-COVID? And we'll get to COVID after that. And how has India sort of managed to navigate that?
Well, the way I see it, the big event after the end of the bipolar Cold War system and with part of the unipolar moment was really globalization. Was, as you said, a unipolar world where, at least for goods and for capital, the world was relatively open. Maybe not so much for people, not for ideas either. I mean, IPRs and so on were actually tightened. But certainly it was a globalized, open, and India did very well out of the globalization decades, out of the 90s and the noughts, as did China. We both were probably the biggest beneficiaries of those decades. But with the crisis, the global financial crisis in 2008, which then morphed into a much wider economic crisis, I think we entered into a whole new phase. And then we started seeing the downsides of globalization, of what globalization had done to us, in four big trends, I would say. One is the globalized economy started fragmenting, becoming regional. Suddenly, I mean, WTO lost steam, the whole Doha round. And what you saw was the emergence of large regional blocs. NAFTA, by any other name, it's been renegotiated. The EU, economic integration. In Asia, you had two competing sort of visions, RCEP, which was broad, included us in the negotiations, TPP, which was supposed to be a higher standard, but then the US pulled out of TPP, and now Li Keqiang has said at the NPC that China is quite happy to think of joining the new TPP with Japan and the others. So you probably have an Asian sort of free trade area, large economic bloc, where it goes beyond free trade. It goes to a much closer integration, actually. So you have a fragmentation and a regionalization of the global economy. Secondly, because globalization threatened identities, especially local identities and so on, you have the politics of emotion and the rise of new authoritarians. I mean, it's fed by urbanization, it's by displacement of populations, alienation, etc. But basically, you've had new authoritarians coming to power across the world. I mean, from 2012 onwards, whether it's Japan, China, India, and you can see the morphing and the evolution of leaders who were already in place into new authoritarians. Trump, I think, was probably one of the last. Maybe Bolsonaro is the last one. But let's see. But that's the second big shift. That matters for the world. I mean, of course, it matters to the people who rules them, but it matters to the world because the new authoritarians have very little performance legitimacy. They rely on personality cults, and they rely on ultranationalism, emotion, for their legitimacy. And therefore, their room for maneuver, for give and take, for diplomacy, for being reasonable, is actually much less than previously. So their ability to deal with crisis is much less. Thirdly, huge shifts in the balance of power. In 1980, the advanced economies, not counting the US, which accounted for about 27% of world GDP, the advanced economies accounted at that stage for almost, at one stage, over 60% of the world economy, 62% or so. By 2016, the emerging countries accounted for 62%, and this is largely at the extent of Europe, at the expense of Europe, whose share in global GDP has shrunk. I mean, today in PPP terms, of course, India and China together just account for almost 25, 26%. China is the largest chunk of that, about 18% of global GDP. And that has other effects. You see a reaction by the established powers. Why is there China-US contention? Why does the US now say that, oh, rivalry with other powers is now back? They no longer see global issues like global terrorism and so on as their main issue, because they're pushing back against what they see as the rise of China as the emergence of a peer competitor. They saw off the Soviet Union, they saw off Japan in the 80s when she looked like a potential peer competitor. Now they plan to see off the Chinese. So China-US contention is one consequence of that. The center of gravity of world politics has come to Asia and from the mid-Atlantic, and the center of gravity of the world economy is also here now. And as a result, flashpoints in Asia now are much more volatile. There's an edginess to geopolitics, whether it's Taiwan, South China Sea, East China Sea, even our border with China, which is in a different place from what it was before. And the fourth big shift is that, frankly, the so-called liberal international order, which was never very liberal or orderly for the rest of us outside the West, but certainly whatever it was, that US-led order, that's gone. I mean, the US is not leading it, and it's incapable of dealing with the issues that face us today. And we have a whole new set of issues. Forget pandemic, but you have climate change. You have an energy revolution going on. You have international terrorism. You have cybersecurity. These are all issues that require cooperative solutions just at the time when you don't have an international order, no obvious leaders, and where it's actually shrunk. So today, if you ask me what shapes geopolitics, the world today is multipolar economically, because the Chinese have grown to the point where you can actually see several poles in the global economy. But in military terms, globally, it's still unipolar. In East and Southeast Asia, it's tending to bipolarity. In South and West Asia, it's tending towards multipolarity, because there are other powers as well. And so you have a very, frankly, if you say politically, so what's the balance? I'd say it's very confused. It's very hard to say today. And China is not yet a global superpower. She might be in economic terms, but the only power which has a military reach to be able to intervene across the world is really the US. But her will to do so is no longer what it was before, either to provide global public goods, maritime security, etc., or to intervene politically. So we are between orders. And that, for me, is the four big things that we also have to cope with, we as India. And that's a whole new situation. It's not a stable situation. It's an uncertain situation. And it's in that we were already in bad enough shape. In that shape, we then got hit by the pandemic shock.
Right. So that's what I'm going to sort of get to next, right? There's been lots of talk about the idea that COVID is fundamentally going to change just just the way we live, the way we interact. And in many ways, it has, right? So the way we get out now, the way we engage. We were having this conversation before we started the webinar about how we no longer sit in a room and have this conversation. So in many ways, there has been a change. There has been a fundamental shift in terms of also how we look at what national security is, with health, public health becoming important, far more important than what it was considered some time back, or at least in terms of the public discourse. But has the pandemic sort of fundamentally changed the way politics and geopolitics and the world order, or the direction in which the order was heading? So from what you've just told us, you could see this friction between the US and China, or between the established powers and rising powers anyway existing. Technology was a component of competition even before COVID. Disinformation, information disorder existed before COVID. So has COVID and the pandemic sort of fundamentally reshaped the way we think about these things? Has it accelerated some of these trends? Or are there sort of, or is there sort of an inflection point that we can expect, say, coming down the road, when, let's assume, the Chinese find a vaccine to COVID? Would that sort of be that fundamental inflection point where everything changes and again sort of the world order pivots and the balance of power shifts? How do we sort of make sense of all of this?
For me, COVID, or the pandemic, has so far at least primarily accelerated the trends that we were talking about. But I mean, as Stalin said, at some stage quantity becomes quality. And I think we're getting close to that stage where when there's enough acceleration, then you start seeing new things. And so there is an element of the new also, of disruption, as you called it, in what we're seeing now. And let me look at, of the four things I mentioned: economic fragmentation. You've seen what's happened to the global economy. It's crashed. And I mean, the US economy lost something like 30% of GDP, according to some estimates, which in 4 months, which according to the history books, it took them 4 years to do after 1929, after the Depression. And so this is a real shock to the global economy. And so we are in a new economic environment of slow growth, where protectionist barriers are going up. First thing everybody did was stop movement, stop the flow of stop aircraft, for instance. Shipping is down to about 30% of what it was before. And you can see that economic fragmentation. Every major leader is talking about self-reliance, not just us. I mean, our prime minister does so, but so did Xi Jinping. And Mr. Trump's views of international trade. So politically also, we've seen a tremendous rise in insularity. In really, politics has become entirely local. And each of the leaders today is, and I think this is frankly because they don't know how to deal with the crisis, with the pandemic. And they have no idea of whether they're going to come out successful or not. First thing, therefore, is blame somebody else. Blame the WHO. If you're American, blame China. If you're Chinese, blame America. Find somebody else. Find a minority in your country whom you can blame. Blame somebody else's dirty habits, whatever it is. I mean, there is this, and the blame game you can see being played out in various ways all around the world. In terms of the balance of power, what does the COVID do? What does the pandemic do? Frankly, so far, all powers have been diminished. And they've lost, I've just told you, economic power. They've lost political power. They've lost reputation. So they've certainly lost soft power. Nobody today looks good. Nobody looks like he has the answers. Some of the smaller societies might have coped better with the immediate medical crisis. but you still don't have an answer to the economic crisis, which is much bigger, or the social effects, which frankly is much more frightening than even these, which can probably be fixed, because governments and politicians have almost no experience of dealing with the social effects on these scales. And the edginess to the flashpoints, to the disputes, you've seen each of them. You've seen the end of one country, two systems. Now that China has decided to impose its national security law on Hong Kong with no consultation, not even the pretense of passing it through the Hong Kong Assembly or the Legislative Council. So I think the postponement, therefore, of reunification with Taiwan, and therefore a stepping up of tension there. You've seen what's happened in the South China Sea. You've seen what's happened on our border as well. These are actions where, frankly, all governments are being defensive. And they see this as being defensive actions, but I'm not sure where the spiral goes, because today you have security dilemmas across the Asian subcontinent. And each of those runs the risk of going out of control. So we are now, I think, at the stage where, as I said, quantity is becoming quality. One place where that has already happened is the state is back. And the big state is back by popular demand. I mean, in the name of contact tracing, you now have forms of surveillance which would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. And it doesn't look like these will ever go away. But longer term, I think there is going to be a bigger issue of the social contract in all these countries, because the pandemic has actually accentuated divisions. Already globalization had created huge inequality in our societies. And the way the pandemic has been handled in most societies only increases that division between the haves, the have-nots, those who benefited from globalization and those who didn't. And so in the longer term, I would keep my eye out for social pushback and for a renegotiation of the social contract in all these countries. So all in all, whether it's economic, political, balance of power, whether it's, the situation within our countries, our own politics, frankly, uncertainty is at unprecedented levels. We haven't had this kind of uncertainty in our lifetimes, certainly. And that's 70 years I'm talking about.
Yeah, so with that uncertainty comes the potential of increased volatility, whether it's within societies or between states. And we've seen, so some of this that's been playing out in the last last month and a half or so, we've seen this clamor about an investigation about the origins of COVID. There's been talk about, Taiwan being allowed to the WHO. Earlier this week, we had this dialogue between India and Australia. And the focus is on broadly how India is going to be navigating all of this. Even with, like you mentioned, what's happening with the border with China, and the conversation was about, both sides have tried to play it down in many ways. Yet we've seen things like President Trump tweeting that he'd spoken, although he'd not really spoken to Prime Minister Modi, and then subsequently he did speak to him. So that did happen. But the idea that India is somewhere wedged in the middle of this deepening rivalry between the US and China. And that, as you said, since COVID has sort of accelerated some of these trends, this is a trend that existed. And this has sort of probably become an accelerated competition right now. It's really difficult to see. It's really strange to see how fast this year has gone. In mid-January, the US and China signed this trade deal, and there was some sort of a agreement between the two sides after such a long period of time. And then subsequently, everything's gone downhill with COVID. And it looks like this competition is here to stay, irrespective of whoever takes over in the White House. So how does India conceptualize achieving that large goal of transforming India? How does an Indian government look at achieving that large goal, keeping in mind this volatility and this increased hostility between these two great powers, and how the fact that we are sort of wedged in the middle of all of this? Do we look at, are there more challenges now than there were before? Or are there sort of new opportunities that we can exploit, given that this is an intensified rivalry?
I think there's both. I think there's both risks and there's opportunities. Certainly the risks are higher, but high yield comes from high risk. I mean, you need to, actually use the situation and look for what we can do. You mentioned, for instance, US-China rivalry. Now, ideally, you as an independent actor wishing to be an independent pole would try and position yourself to have better relations with both China and the US than they have with each other. It shouldn't be difficult given the way they're going at each other right now. But that's a theoretical position. In practice, the more the Chinese push on the border, or the more they make demands of you to choose on various issues, the more likely you are to balance towards the US by strengthening your ties with the US, and vice versa. I mean, it would work both ways. That is going to be actually one big issue going forward about where do you place yourself. So far in the last 3 years, certainly from the speech on the Indo-Pacific that Prime Minister Modi made in Shangri-La in July, at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore in July 2018, I think India was positioning itself as an independent pole and separate from both, but ready to work with both. But we have to see whether if their relationship becomes so acrimonious that that is no longer possible, then we'll have to look at other options. But so far, that is, for me, logically, that is the right position to be in. But what do we do in this situation of uncertainty where flashpoints are hot? One thing you cannot do is rely on the multilateral system. As I said, it's been, or maybe I should have expanded on that, none of them worked. The UN Security Council couldn't even meet while the Chinese were chair. When it did meet, it did nothing. G20, G7 did nothing, couldn't agree a declaration because they couldn't agree on whether to call it a Chinese virus or not, or the Wuhan virus. The G20, in complete contrast to what they did after the global financial crisis in 2008, April 2009, frankly meaningless set of words, a lot of bromides. The WHO, you've heard criticism of it already. The US is pulling out. So I don't think we can rely on the international system. And frankly, I'm not sure that all these calls for an apology, for an investigation, for fixing responsibility, I don't see how that will create outcomes which will actually help us or help the world to get past this crisis and improve itself. So what should we then do? We need to do three things. One is, in a much harsher environment, self-strengthening is critical. It is essential. I mean, things like the border, for instance, you must have enough effective power on the border to deter anything going wrong. And that is essential, and it becomes even more essential. So when we talk of self-reliance, I hope that's what we mean. I hope what we mean is actually building up our own internal strength and whether it's economic, whether it's military, whether in all aspects of power, but we need to prioritize the ones which can actually keep us secure in a much more dangerous world. Secondly, because your own power is not going to be enough, especially as the world gets more dangerous, I think we need to look for balancing arrangements. I've already said that the US is an essential partner and has been for many of our issues. Transformation of India, if you want to develop India economically, you cannot do it without the US. She's our largest trading partner when you take goods and services together. If you take goods, it's China. So you can't do without either if you're looking at your economy. But you also need to work with other Asians. And you have to start close to home. You have to work within the subcontinent with your neighbors so that you have a peaceful periphery where you are not then entangled in unnecessary distractions so that you can go about strengthening and transforming India. And thirdly, and I've heard a lot of talk about, oh, we have to follow a maritime strategy. That's where our future is. Of course it is, but that's an expensive strategy. And you have already friends who are very interested in the free and open Indo-Pacific, in the maritime strategy. It is the maritime domain where contention today between China and the US actually takes place. But we are also a continental power. And many of our problems, like the boundary with China, are continental issues, like cross-border terrorism out of Pakistan. These are continental issues, and we need to work with other continental powers if we are to deal with them. Once the US withdraws from Afghanistan, for instance, we'll have a whole new situation to deal with. So there's a whole set of things that we need to do in terms of a continental strategy, which I think we need to, we might not see economic benefit out of it, but it's essential for our security going forward in this very dangerous situation. So that's my sort of summary argument. We need to engage. We can't withdraw from the world, as I said, and we are in many ways dependent on the world, but also we have the ability now to shape the world to a certain extent, which we didn't have 20 years ago, 50 years ago. So I'm not so negative, frankly, about where we're going. I'm actually an optimist. And I think a certain amount of disruption is not bad for us because it'll force us to think and actually do the right thing. We normally do well out of crisis.
Yeah.
Willy-nilly.
Yes. Yes. So I'm going to pose one last question before I start taking, because there are already a bunch of questions that have come up in chat and I'll start taking them. But my last question to you before I start to take those is about specifically China. There's lots of sort of, generally Indian public opinion with regard to China has never really been positive. I mean, at the most, Pew surveys have shown that about 33% of Indians tend to have a positive opinion of China. And that's dipped in terms of the last Pew survey that was done to about 26, 27%. And amid the pandemic, we've seen a lot of, at least social media animation about, boycotting Chinese goods, about, siding with Taiwan in the WHA, and all those sorts of things. And that's probably now accentuated because of what's happening at the border. How should we conceptualize our relationship with China? Should we be looking at China in terms of as a competitor fundamentally, or as potentially an opportunity? And if it's both, how do we sort of achieve that balance of getting both right?
Yes, I think yours was the survey which showed a deterioration in Indian attitudes towards China recently. I think you did that in May.
Yes.
And I think you're absolutely right. I think, but what your survey showed, again, shows an acceleration of an existing trend. If you look over the last 5 years, Indian views of China have steadily deteriorated and have become more and more negative. And I think Indians now, many Indians, 18%, I think, almost believe that this was a bioweapon developed by China. So it's natural, I think, that you see calls to boycott Chinese goods. You see arguments about let's revive the Tibet card, or which if I were Tibetan, I'd feel very unhappy to be called a card. But anyway, or that we should support Taiwan in WHO. But if you look at the practice of the government of India over the last 3 years, certainly since Doklam in 2017, the government itself has been very careful in how it's handled the relationship. We were not the first to say in the WHO that there has to be an investigation, or to say that Taiwan must be admitted. We actually went along with the larger numbers. We've been silent on what happened in Xinjiang. We've been silent on what's going on in Hong Kong. We've been careful on Taiwan. 2 BJP MPs attended President Tsai Ing-wen's inauguration virtually. But apart from that, otherwise, in terms of public statements and behavior by the government, we've been very careful on the Taiwan issue. So it's interesting. Instead, we have, I think, concentrated on what concerns us bilaterally. So one big step we've taken is to put Chinese investments on prior approval. And that, I think, was we also made a statement on the South China Sea, which I think went beyond what we had said before. Could have gone a little further, maybe stressing international law, but at least it did stress our interest, because we do have an interest in freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, and that's a growing interest over time. So you actually have this disconnect, in a sense, between what we are doing officially and what you hear on the media, what public opinion expects, what they want. And I think that reflects actually exactly what you said, that we have a relationship where we both compete and cooperate. After all, the Indian consumer benefits from cheap Chinese goods. But you could say, what about the country? We're paying a huge price for it because of the trade deficit. And there has been almost no Chinese attempt to actually solve that deficit, at least nothing visible, for several years, which they could do much easier being a command economy. It's something that they could have done. So we do have a whole set of bilateral issues. Whether we can use the larger context and whether it's the international context or our other balancing relationships in order to get our way on our bilateral relationships on the issues that really matter to us, I don't know. That is going to be difficult. But certainly there is no getting away from the fact that unless the effective balance of power on the border is at least balanced or slightly in your favor, and that the imbalance doesn't grow, otherwise you will see the ground situation being changed. Because ultimately, in my experience, China's behavior is guided primarily by the relative balance of power. China worked very carefully with the US when there was a huge imbalance in the US favor. After 2008, when she thought that that balance had been reduced, that the West and the US were in terminal decline, her behavior towards the US and the West changed. And for me, that is really where the key to that relationship is. Unless we can ensure that the effective balance, I'm not saying the overall balance of until you catch up with the economy, which might be 4 times or so bigger than yours, that until that happens, you won't have. No, not at all. It's the effective balance in each of these issues, and pick and choose your issues, the ones that really matter to you, deal with them. But please focus on the outcomes, not on winning some media war, some propaganda war, some event. I think if we focus on the outcomes on the ground in that relationship, then I think we'll be much better off. But certainly, I don't see that being an easy relationship in the short term. The longer term, of course, I'm a much bigger optimist as far as India is concerned.
All right. Okay. Thank you so much, Ambassador Menon. I'm going to start taking questions from our attendees. Like I've anticipated, there are lots of China questions, but I'm going to just hold on that for a bit. Otherwise, we'll end up talking about China for a very long time. So this is a question by Salil Ravindran. He asks, have we failed to manage our friendly neighbors well in the last 2 decades? These include Nepal, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Myanmar. And doing that, have we lost the opportunity to keep the expansionary ambitions of China under check?
Well, there's 2 parts to that, Salil. I think, have we failed to manage our neighbors well? I think you have to realize that there is always going to be a certain natural tension inbuilt in this relationship. You are much bigger. You have a certain economic, social, other weight which you bring to this. And these are all, including the Indian Republic, these are in historical terms relatively new states. We might be old nations, but these are brand new states. And in many of them, the state building involves building nationalism. Pakistan is the extreme case where there is an identity issue. But even in the others, there is a certain fear of being overwhelmed, of being dominated by India. And therefore, they will look for balancing arrangements. Whether it used to be in the 50s and 60s, they look to the US, to others, or now they look to China. And that actually, depending on how your relationship with China is perceived by them, they will try and use that to balance you and to get what they want. That's natural behavior. So we have to accept that there will be a certain element of dissonance and pushing and pulling in the relationship. But overall, I think you have certain affinities and connections with these neighbors, which frankly are so deep that we need to be sensitive to how we deal with them. Why did all the Nepalese parties come to you in 2004, 2005, while they were trying to build a new democratic order and trying to mainstream the Maoists who had been fighting a civil war for over 12 years in their country? And you did help them, but they made up their own mind ultimately. So it's because they understand you and you understand them. And that relationship that you have with your neighbors is something that I think we should actually concentrate on and work. And this is why these are not relationships which you can just apply a standard realist mold and say, what's their interest, what's my interest? These are relationships which involve emotions, involve people, involve a lot of history. They're much more complicated than IR theory would tell you it is. So whether we've managed well or not, I'm not going to get into that. I think they have deteriorated in the recent past. Maybe because you can't call somebody termites and expect them to like you. And there have been maladroit steps on both sides. I mean, it's not only one-sided. That, I think, there are things that we can avoid. There are things we shouldn't be saying. But equally, there are things that they shouldn't be saying. But these are said for domestic political reasons in most cases. And I think we need to understand that and move on beyond that. Because our broader interest in India is actually in integrating the subcontinent economically, in actually working together to ensure that we have a peaceful periphery so that we can go about our primary business of transforming India. And for that, we need to work with our neighbors. As we've worked with Bangladesh, improved our relations on, and if you look at the security situation between us, how much we've managed to improve it over the last 12, 15 years. And that is really quite an achievement. And actually, there is potential to do that with many of our other neighbors.
All right. I'm going to now club two questions together because they deal with the theme of China, and then we'll try and move to other ones also. Indrani Bagchi from Times of India is asking us, given what you see today, how would you describe the kind of power that China is becoming? And how would China exercise that power? What should be the lessons India should take? So that's her question. There's another one which I want to sort of attach to that, which is from General P.K. Sharma from USA. How do we reach this new modus vivendi with China? And you've spoken about this in the past, that the old sort of agreements that we had sort of fraying in some ways. And what are the leverages that we need to develop or that we have in order to reach this new modus vivendi?
What kind of power will China be? Today, I think you're dealing with a very unusual situation where all leaderships are under tremendous domestic pressure and strain. And therefore, they feel forced to show their not just nationalist credentials, but the fact that the country is only safe with them. And so in a sense of crisis, a sense that the world is against us, seems to work for the new authoritarians, wherever they are. It's not only in China, but also elsewhere. And this problem, I think, we are going to face until we can see the end of the pandemic and we can see the end in sight. So I wouldn't characterize this as 100% normal behavior for the future. I would hope this is not the new normal. But I'm fairly certain that it can't be sustained forever. The question is, at the end of the pandemic, will any of these powers, all of them are going to be diminished, will any of them be in any domestic shape to perform responsibly on the international stage? And that is a real worry. As I said, we are now approaching the point where it's difficult to say that things will it will certainly never go back to what it was before, but that things will actually stabilize at a different equilibrium, even in a low growth economy, but that at least the political ability to deal with the outside world rationally will return. I find that very difficult. So I don't have one word to describe China as a power today. I would hope that at the end of this, she doesn't end up frustrated power and a lot of that is going to depend on how they see the future, how they see their hope of achieving the China dream. I think certainly reunification with Taiwan on present trends looks like it's been postponed, if not pushed off considerably. Let's see. We'll have to watch and be very careful. Are there lessons for India? Frankly, first we need to deal with the crisis, the immediate crisis. We have a health crisis, we have an economic crisis, we have a crisis of politics, not just in our immediate neighborhood, the subcontinent, but in Asia as a whole. And we have to maneuver these rather complicated relationships, what worsen China-US relations mean for us, etc. So I wouldn't draw lessons from China. I would actually draw lessons from what our interests are and at the outcomes that we can actually hope to work for, rather than trying to imitate any other power. About a new modus vivendi, you know, the middle of the crisis is maybe not the best time to do it, but the reason I have said for, well, 2 years now that we need a new modus vivendi is because both our countries have changed, our definition of our interests have changed. We are rubbing up against each other in the periphery, which frankly we both share. Whether it's in the South China Sea, whether it's in the Indian subcontinent, in various other places, we are rubbing up against each other. We see the Chinese in the Indian Ocean. We see the Chinese more active in the internal politics of our neighbors like Nepal. When that sort of thing starts happening, we need to get a much clearer understanding of A, how we deal with our differences. Boundary, of course, is one, but there are other differences as well. For me, the periphery is really one of the most important. But B, what are the core interests that we both now see? Because we both see ourselves very differently from what we saw ourselves in 1988, where we were faced with a unipolar world coming and it was very different. And we saw the end of the Cold War coming and we needed to adjust. That was a very different world. And today we face a very different world again. So that's why, how do you arrive at a modus vivendi? There's no other way except to sit down and talk these issues through and to come to an understanding about how do you respect each other's core concerns. If you can't, how do you manage them? And how do you limit the damage that that kind of dissonance can create? I don't, today see conflict as somehow inevitable or coming soon. For a very simple reason. It's in no great power's interest. I don't see a payoff for any of the great powers from direct great power conflict, which would justify. And certainly that's not, I think, where we're heading. But the risk is that we get dragged into other people's problems, into local problems, that some flashpoint, and there's always a risk of miscalculation when there's so much tinder lying about. That's really the problem for me. And so can we arrive at a modus vivendi? I don't know, but it's worth trying at least to talk to them and to clarify our own thinking about what's possible, what's not, where they're going, what they're doing. And the same for them. They should be in no doubt about how we see our basic interests.
All right, okay. We'll move away from China for a bit. There are two questions again which sort of touch on a similar theme. One is from Rishabh and the other from Apeksha. Rishabh asks about the role of things like CAA and sort of the situation in Kashmir today, how that sort of plays a role in Indian foreign policy, what impact does this have? And sort of attached is this question by Apeksha, which talks about the idea of the concept of nationalism. We thought that nationalism was history in many ways, but with the sudden rise of this new nationalistic or populism wave that you also spoke about around the world, what role does that play in foreign policy going forward? What role would it play in India's foreign policy going forward?
I see this, what you mentioned, CAA, JNK, this whole discussion about citizenship, about whether certain communities are equal citizens or not, about how do we define, do we bring religious criteria into our definitions? I see all this as part of the renegotiation of the social contract, which has actually started in India. So we are now questioning some of the fundamentals on which our constitution was written. This is an internal matter, but it does have external effects. There's no question. One very simple one. US-India relations have depended for their tremendous transformation under the Vajpayee government, the Manmohan Singh government, and right now to a very great extent on bipartisan political support within the US. And yet, over the last year or so, there has certainly been a fading of Democratic support. And unfortunately, all the Indian Americans in the US Congress are Democrats. And so there is a risk, if you do this, that you start alienating communities abroad who could be important to the implementation of their foreign policy. And I think some of that has already happened. Now, you can say that it doesn't matter what the UN High Commissioner for Refugees says, for instance, or the High Commissioner for Human Rights says, because the multilateral system is as good as defunct. Perhaps, but that's not a position you're used to. And it also opens the door for China to raise J&K in the Security Council, for instance. That embarrasses you. And it also shows the limits of your power. And that's not a very good situation to get into. So it does have effects, but primarily these are issues that we need to sort out at home for ourselves. If we are not clear about what kind of India we're building, what kind of India we want to be, and if we're questioning the very basis of citizenship, redefining it, then, and if, as you said, and I think Apeksha said, that we're now relying increasingly on nationalism, yes, that does make a big difference. It certainly doesn't make you popular in the neighborhood. And somebody just asked us earlier about what about other neighbors in the subcontinent. Certainly, the more virulent your expression of nationalism, and you know, there's an old distinction between patriots are those who love their countries, nationalists are those who hate other countries. And I think that's really where we need to draw the line. It's one thing to love your own country, but after all, your interests are not necessarily in contradiction with all other countries. You don't have to do other people down to be a patriot or to do well by your own country. So I think we need to start remembering that distinction. Will nationalism continue to be stoked? I think the new authoritarians will, because frankly, as I said, they have very little performance legitimacy. None of them have really delivered in the last 8-10 years that they've been at the helm in some countries, shorter periods in others. So they can't point to a great record of fulfilling all the grand promises that they made. And since they can't do that, since they lack performance legitimacy, where else do they go? They go to ultranationalism, they go to emotional appeals, to religion, to other things that they can use to drum up sentiment in their favor. Or they look for external threats, and which will unite people behind them, rally around the flag, and therefore around the leader, around whom a personality cult has been built. And that is a real risk to the international system and to peace and to our own security, if that's where we are going. So for me, that's one of the biggest risks that we face today. This use of ultranationalism, this use of chauvinism, and frankly, the crisis, the pandemic has just increased xenophobia around the world. You can see it everywhere. And that's not a good thing at all from our point of view.
Yeah, and it's also creating a backlash, right? I mean, the kind of things that we're seeing that are happening in the US and Europe right now. There was a backlash also in the sort of between states. That is what we saw between China and African countries when the racism instances in Guangzhou came out. So yeah, that is true. I'm going to pick two questions now. Again, I can see the link between them, but the people who actually posted them might not see the link between them. But Gaurav asks about the fact that given the growing uncertainty and changing power equations, do you believe it's time for India to revisit its nuclear posture and doctrine? And what do you make of the reported Chinese endeavor to potentially increase the size of its nuclear arsenal? And how would that impact us? And what I'm going to link this to is another question by Akshay, who asks, who says that Ambassador Menon, you spoke about how high returns come from high risk. What are the potential high risk moves that India can undertake, which may yield high returns in the post-COVID world order?
Well, about our nuclear posture and doctrine, you know, I think I've never believed, and I think most of those who actually devised our posture doctrine in the past didn't believe that the nuclear was the answer to the entire spectrum of violence. We were not going to deal with terrorism by having nuclear weapons, or even conventional warfare by having nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons were designed to deal with the nuclear end of the spectrum, to prevent nuclear threat and blackmail, and to deter the use of nuclear weapons against India. And that purpose they have served. And for that purpose, frankly, a no first use, a survivable second strike capability, and the ability to inflict unacceptable damage on the adversary is sufficient. Not just sufficient, has worked so far. But I think there are always things happening in terms of technology, in terms of what other countries are doing. You mentioned China's shifts. China has always mixed both her conventional and nuclear missiles. And that has always been, I think, designed to create uncertainty in the minds of others and to increase China's deterrence, therefore. But that is actually worrying because it also suggests an ability to transition to nuclear warfighting from their existing doctrine. Whether, secondly, technology has changed. Surveillance technologies today, sensing, is so good that at some stage it's conceivable that states will decide that we can no longer conceal our weapons, that we are actually known to the others and therefore are exposed to a first strike. In which case, the decision could be, then let's use our weapons first before we lose them. And that kind of situation we want to avoid, or at least let's shift towards a first use doctrine or to tactical uses of nuclear weapons, etc. So technological developments and obviously what states expect to have to deal with in the future, the adversaries they expect, the kinds of war they expect, could change what's happening around us and the kinds of situations we face in the nuclear domain. That we have to keep watching. And that's why I say we have to keep reviewing our doctrines. We have to keep seeing, do they still work in this situation, in the new situation? And that's something that's best done by those who have access to all the information, the data, the intelligence, those who can actually do that within government. It's not something you and I can do, on a Zoom call. And frankly, but our job, I think, is to tell them every once in a while, by the way, look at this. What about that? Have you factored that? If you factored it in, fine. And I think so far, all governments have done that, including this government. Every government has reviewed it regularly. So far, we've stuck with what we have. We've hinted at changes sometimes. Some statements maybe suggested, hinted. Maybe individuals felt differently. But so far at least, the declared official policy of the government of India stayed what it is. And I think it still holds, it still works. What are the high-risk moves we could take? Well, for me, there's 3 or 4 things that I think we should be doing, which I think we should actually take a huge initiative in the neighborhood, both on economic integration in the subcontinent, both on economic integration and as a provider of security in the subcontinent to our neighbors. And I think this idea that, we can't discuss security, we can't do politics, is too messy, let's keep that out, let's just do economy and social, on which SARC was founded, I think those days are over. Today, I think we can actually go out, we have the capability, we have also, I think, the will to be able to do this. I think that's one place where we should be willing to take risks for peace, in our own immediate neighborhood. This is our home. And if we don't do it for our home, frankly, it's not worth it. Secondly, I think the other big risk we should take, and it is a risk, is go back into RCEP. Because you cannot run a political, military, defense, security, cooperation, look east, act east, whatever you want to call it, with Southeast Asia, East Asia, even with friends like Japan, Vietnam, and so on, unless it is backed by an economic integration and work. And once RCEP takes off, you are going to be sitting outside. And by sitting outside, by walking out, what you have effectively said is, I don't think that India is ever going to be competitive. That's what we are effectively saying by walking away. Instead of saying, we need the following things in order, we need this timing, we need these sectors, we need the following things. We had 8 years of negotiation to do this. Much of it was about that. But that's one risk that I think we really should be taking in our own interest. Because if the world is fragmenting economically into 3 big blocks and you're in none of them, and you depend for more than half your GDP on the world economy, which you do today, then how are you going to prosper? As you get squeezed out of markets, as you stop getting either your energy, your fertilizers, your commodities, you have no non-ferrous metals worth the name, all of which you depend on the rest of the world. I mean, I could go on and on and on. And this, so for me, engagement, and you need to take risks for that engagement. Yes, you need to fix things at home, but you can't say, when I am 100% ready, I will engage with the world. You need to engage now for the transformation of India.
Right. That sort of answers both of those things. That those are sort of big risks which we sort of backed away from, particularly in our neighborhood, and we've seen sort of increased tensions in our neighborhood with Nepal, particularly. There's a question in the group about the current sort of issues that we are having with Nepal. Would you like to comment on that?
You know, I'm not au fait with all the day-to-day business that goes on with Nepal. It's never been a very easy relationship because I think, as I said, there are identity issues here. So for me, actually, that's a relationship that is very important for our security. And that's somewhere where actually our own security should actually trump various other political and economic sort of differences that we might have.
All right. Okay, so I'm going to pivot to something which you'd spoken about how when the pandemic hit, it sort of showed you the limitations also of multilateral institutions and engagement in that sense. There's a question from Ritul Gaur about, and I'm going to read it out. It says that considering we are moving towards a more isolationist world, and as you speak about the response from the international institutions has been anything but substantive, where does this put us knowing the nature of challenges in the future is going to be global? Ritul says that he's writing from Kota, Rajasthan, and they just witnessed a crazy locust attack. So problems like that, problems like climate change, how do we deal with global problems if the institutional architecture starts to break down?
Well, my answer, and I don't know if some of you have heard my mantra before, is issue-based coalitions of willing. Pick your issues, the ones that really matter to you, to India's transformation, and find partners to work with. These will vary. My one example, for instance, is today the US Fifth Fleet is the one that guarantees the safe and secure passage of oil and energy through the Straits of Hormuz, right? But the US has now become a net exporter of energy. She doesn't need the energy that comes out of the Middle East, out of the Gulf, Persian Gulf. Who are the biggest importers? China, India, Japan, South Korea. So why don't we four, plus local regional powers, who has a navy, Iran has a navy, work with them and make sure, don't get into their internal politics, don't get into their fights with each other, but at least work, build a coalition of the willing to guarantee the secure flow of cheap energy out through the Persian Gulf. That's something we could do. And I would pick examples like that. Break the problems down into things that matter to you and find your partners. Indian Ocean Maritime Security, they're already working with the US, with Australia, with Japan, with others. They all have an interest. And frankly, everybody has an interest. And Prime Minister Modi said rightly in Singapore in 2018, how we need to approach maritime security all the way across the Indo-Pacific. But there are other issues. Cyber, clearly, you'll have a completely different set of partners to work with on cyber security, on energy security. You pick the issue. But for me, that's the answer. In a fragmented world, which is politically, as you said, where there is no multilateral impetus to cooperation, where these are problems which are beyond any individual country or even any 2 or 3 countries, build coalitions, deal with issues. I think the solar coalition is a great idea. You might not solve all of climate change, but at least it makes a real contribution both in terms of energy and climate change. And that's something that you need to push. Build other such coalitions with countries who have the capability and the will to work with you. It won't always be the same. It'll be complicated, a lot of work, variable geometry, etc. But I think that is the way forward in this situation.
All right. I have another question, which is, again, of a different track altogether, something that we've not touched upon so far. Manpreet Sethi asks, globalization in terms of free movement of people, capital, trade, etc., may have been disturbed by the pandemic, but the globalization of information has actually increased. Does this impose burdens on government decision making? Does this make governments more vulnerable to media, social media, and public perceptions? How do governments sort of deal with this? How do they insulate themselves from this? Yeah, so your thoughts on that?
You're absolutely right, because I mean, I've had a Chinese friend tell me that, you know, the governments run the risk of being hijacked by opinion on social media. They actually think it represents public opinion because that's what they see. And there's this flood of information, of opinion, actually, not so much information, that threatens to overwhelm the policy process. And I think that's true, not just, you know, maybe in China, certainly in India and everywhere else. And so you see Twitter wars, people actually think it matters if they can win an argument on social media. This is where my answer is, look at the outcomes. Please go back to the outcomes. And there are no technological fixes for this. When you see a battle about monopoly today in the technology field, after all, the big five in the US, the big Chinese three, I suppose, tech companies today, actually between them, manage to control what we think is a free and open internet. If anybody can find a way of breaking these monopolies, then you can actually talk of a free flow of information. But today there is no free flow of information. Most of what we're seeing is either sponsored or being used for a purpose, or is actually motivated in order to propel certain ideas, certain convictions around the world. For me, this is not very different from the kind of propaganda that radio used to be used for, the kind of propaganda that television was used for. This is not something brand new. Most of these technologies, and it doesn't matter, you can go all the way back in history, most technologies are used for the same things by human beings because human nature doesn't change that fundamentally. We use it to control others or to bully others. We use it to make money. And we try and monopolize these technologies, but very soon they actually spread. They become cheap enough or accessible enough for everybody. This is true of every technology over time. And that's what we're seeing today in terms of media, in terms of, I think the word information is wrong because what you're seeing on these is much more opinion, is much more prejudice, much less information.
All right. I'm going to now sort of go to, again, places that we've not sort of touched it. And it's fascinating to me that we're about 75 minutes into the conversation. Actually, I'm quite proud of the fact that we've not mentioned Pakistan so far.
Well done.
And I'm going to sort of avoid it for some time. I'm going to go to two countries. Again, it's a little, I don't know if this reflects of the confidence of the India-US relationship, or just how, or the priorities that we have right now with China that we don't even think about the US anymore. But I wanted to get your views on US engagement in the region. There's a question by Akshay, which talks about Afghanistan and the fact that the US will be exiting from Afghanistan sometime soon. How should India be responding to that? And first we'll do that, and then we'll look at again the role of Russia. How do you see Russia navigating, because it's really badly hit by the pandemic, but how do you see it navigating the relationship between the US and China and the Indo-Russia relationship, if you could talk about that?
Well, on the US leaving Afghanistan, my own sense is, you know, if it were done to a best that were done quickly, I wish they just get up and go. rather than trying to cobble together some face-saving device which enables them to say, we have a peace process in place, and we have an agreement. I mean, this is, like Kissinger in '73 with Le Duc Tho and Vietnam. If you want to go, get up and go, because this is the worst time possible for us. This is when everybody is charging their price to enable the US to have a face-saving way out. Whether it's Pakistan, whether it's all the others. And it enables all of Afghanistan's other neighbors to behave completely irresponsibly, to work with their proxies, to take no responsibility for what's going on. If there is going to be a US withdrawal, and I think there is, because I think that is something that for President Trump at least is very important for his election, to be able to say he brought the troops home. I think the consequences of that are actually going to be primarily for Pakistan. After all, Afghanistan has never been Pakistanized. Pakistan has been Talibanized. That's the direction it works in. And for the other immediate neighbors. And then I think they will see the risks of what could come out of Afghanistan in terms of extremism, in terms of terrorism, and so on, and will then actually be reasonable and work together to try and do something about it. I would hope that we would show the patience and the good sense to actually work with others in Afghanistan to try and secure at least those gains which have been made. Because Afghanistan today is not the Afghanistan of the Islamic Emirate or even of 2001, 2002. This is a very different Afghanistan today. And I think we need to work with our Afghan friends, but also with others who have influence and friends there. And ultimately, what will happen in Afghanistan is going to be determined by the Afghans, not by anybody else. But I am not so worried that, oh, the Americans are going and what's going to happen to us. No, I don't think so at all. In fact, I think it's going to make people much more responsible and make people actually own up to their own responsibilities and deal with it. If I were Pakistani, I'd be very nervous of the prospect.
All right, and Russia? How do we look at the role of Russia within the sort of competition between the US and China, and also the India-Russia relationship?
I think, it's from an Indian point of view, it's unfortunate that the West has consistently pushed Russia into China's arms. And that today, if China can work to try and consolidate Eurasia, the Eurasian landmass, through the Belt and Road, through railways, pipelines, etc., working with Central Asian countries, a lot of it is due to this fact that the Russians are going along with this. And they don't see an alternative because they do share an interest, which they actually share with India also, in preventing the rise of extremism, of terrorism in Central Asia, and it's spilling over into Russia's soft underbelly and the stance. And that it is that common interest against the West and against extremism and terrorism in Central Asia, which actually is the glue in the China-Russia relationship. There is an economic factor also, but that's the political and the security glue. So it seems to me that for Russia as well, it is really a multipolar Asia which is a preferable alternative to a consolidation. But they don't see a prospect of that. And as long as they are under pressure from the West, COVID could change that. You saw that President Trump invited President Putin to the G7. He wants to expand the G7. I'm not sure how he's going to do it, whether he'll manage to do it, but at least his instinct is there to try and bring the Russians back into the fold. So certainly the Europeans, I think, will see economic opportunity in working with Russia. Germany, certainly. The other East Europeans, smaller East European countries might still have problems with it. But the larger economies in Europe, whether it's France, whether it's Germany, whether it's Italy, I think they will see advantage in working with Russia. So I think the pandemic might actually shake this loose. The present alignment that we see working for China in Central Asia, which in a sense, I mean, China's pushing at open doors now, or has been for the last few years. But let's see how it shakes out after the pandemic.
All right. Okay. I'm going to consolidate a couple of questions that have come in with regard to what's been happening on the border between India and China. And that will be the last set before I ask for your final comments. Essentially, do you see what's happened at the border as a matter of a specific incident, a sort of a failure of intelligence, something that is structural that you're going to see more and more of? How do you sort of conceptualize what's happened at the border between India and China at the moment in the last month or so? And what's your view on the media's coverage of all of that? Has the media, because in Doklam, during the Doklam crisis, the Indian media was very restrained, whereas the Chinese were not. And this time around, we've seen sort of this trading of so-called psyops between Global Times publishing things and things like that. So how do you see the role of the media in all of this? And what is your take on what's happening at the border right now?
Well, frankly, I think first we must admit that we don't know enough to draw great conclusions about this. We don't even know the actual situation on the border. I have no access to anything except the media. And from what you see in the media, you're getting completely contradictory versions of what's going on, of where we are, of where they are. But going back to first principles, I assume that there has been a considerable improvement in your capabilities in these places, and that the Chinese are attempting to restore the balance in their favor, because after all, the construction of this road does improve your logistics, and presumably they have local reasons to try and assert their dominance over the road and so on. But as I said, we don't know. We don't know enough to draw big conclusions. And certainly at the operational level, I don't think we should even try. I mean, we should leave this to those whose job it is to do. But there is a larger issue where if what we have been told across the board and what the government of India has not denied, if they are now claiming the entire Galwan Valley as being on their side of the LAC, they have shifted their definition of the LAC. They've shifted their claim line or where the boundary is, they've shifted their version of the LAC. And then this is a whole new border. My own sense, frankly, is that yes, this is part of a general pattern of Chinese behavior, whether it's in Hong Kong, Taiwan, et cetera, South China Sea, and so on. But that vis-a-vis India, I don't think this is messaging. If this is messaging, it's the most inefficient way of sending a message, because we're all busy guessing what's the message. Oh, it's don't be with the US. Oh, it's don't do JNK. Oh, don't do this, don't do. I mean, that's hardly messaging. If you want a message, you tell us clearly what you want. No, I think it's a message which cannot be said clearly. And what is that message? That we have the power to embarrass you when it suits us. And I think that is a psychological dominance maneuver rather than a simple message saying, don't do this, do that. And I think that is something which, and you've seen this actually play out in other crises as well. Ultimately, as I've said before, it seems to me that what determines Chinese behavior is their perception of the relative balance of power. And I think but they see power in all its dimensions. They don't just see it as military power or just political. They know that reputation, that psychological, that all these factors enter into it. And so for me, I see it as part of a larger process. Does this represent a whole new pattern of Chinese behavior? I think we have to keep our minds open on that possibility. Certainly, this is different Chinese behavior from before. I don't think it's what they did before. It's in multiple places and the way they've gone about it. And I mean, today, for instance, we see reports yesterday actually of thinning. But thinning is not the issue here. The issue here is actually restoring the earlier status quo.
Yeah.
And I think until you know what exactly they're saying, what we have said, what's happened in the negotiation, and we know the facts on the ground, I'd be very careful drawing big conclusions at this stage.
All right, that's a great time for me to actually do a not so subtle plug. So if any of the people who are attending are interested in sort of following news about China, my colleague Suyash Desai and I do 2 newsletters which are weekly. One is Eye on China, which does a broad sweep of coverage on China related stories of the week, and Suyash focuses on the PLA. You can subscribe to those through our website, through the Takshashila website. Ambassador Menon, before I wrap
add
up,
my voice to that and
All
say
right.
how useful they are. Both
Thank
of
you.
them. Please
Thank
do
you.
read them if you're interested in China.
Thank you so much. Ambassador Menon, before we sort of conclude, my last question to you is, and this is sort of me channeling my inner journalist from a previous career. What are the 3 things that
I didn't
India
answer
must
your
do?
media question, by the way.
Yes. What are the 3 things that India must do or should be doing to tide over the next year or 2 years, given that we're still to see the tail end of the health crisis from the pandemic in India?
Well, I think first priority has to be getting our economy going, which means we have to work on those relationships which can do something for our economy. Secondly, we have to, as I said, build a peaceful periphery around ourselves in South Asia. And I think that's one place where I said we should take risks. And the reason I said first priority is getting our economy back on its feet and getting growth going. And as part of that, I would list the RCP and our economic outreach and our whole attitude to and defining clearly what we mean by self-reliance, that it's not autarky, that it's not, and showing it in practice, because we've been raising customs duties for the last 4 years in every budget, and that's not a good sign to the rest of the world. But so the economy, the neighborhood, and I would say a huge amount of self-strengthening, which would ensure that we can reintroduce some effective balance in our relationships with Pakistan and China. More China than Pakistan, because Pakistan to me is a subset of our China problem.
All right. I think that sort of covers a whole sweep of things that we thought we'd cover, and we're just about out of time. Thank you so much, Ambassador Menon. General Menon, would you want to have a word? If you're, yes.
On behalf of Takshila, I would like to thank Ambassador Menon for that really interesting insight. And you're not ever disappointed, and this was really very good. And I think the challenges that you have highlighted are not going to be easy, but I believe that we have the inner strength to do that. And on that optimistic note, thank you so much. Takshashila has always considered you a friend, and we hope to strengthen that friendship as we go along. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks. I enjoyed that.
Thank you.